In the early days of compulsory education in the United States, teachers might test a child's understanding of a particular amount of content. And when that child passed that test, that child was able to move on to more content. And if the child didn't, the child might be, held back. They would continue to work on that content before they moved on. But into the 20th century, there was a real desire for education to become more scientific and to be able to measure student achievement more effectively, especially as the space race and Cold War emerged. In 1965, the Elementary and Secondary Education Act was passed, and this act tied federal funding for schools to the schools doing some sort of standardized test. So that tied the Title I funding from the federal government to the administration of some sort of standardized test. And if the scores were predominantly low, there had to be some sort of remediation that occurred. However, the responsibility for this was not placed solely on individual schools. Schools and states had to work together to sort of work on that, and it really did not allow at all for any sort of national curriculum. So in 1965, this was the first time that children were required to take a standardized test in our country. So that means my parents spent the bulk of their schooling experience without having to take a standardized test. This is a recent phenomenon in our educational culture and something that we should remember. And the Elementary and Secondary Education Act of 1965 was renewed every 3 or so years. It still continues to be renewed to this day. But something changed significantly in 2001 when this act was renewed as the No Child Left Behind Act. When that happened, the wording of the act changed to some degree, and it tied that Title I funding from the federal government to the actual achievement scores a school reported. So funding for low-performing schools was tied to adequate yearly progress. Schools had to report adequate yearly progress to raise these scores in order to continue to receive funding. And if they were not raising these scores adequately, various interventions could be taken, and the most severe of which is firing everyone at the school, closing the school, starting all over. So in the face of this sort of intense political pressure and funding pressure, schools started to focus far more on drilling students to raise their scores on standardized tests. And so we started to see an increased focus on test preparation in the course of an average school day or the average experience of a school child. So over time in our country's history, testing, when it first standardized testing was happening, was mostly for informational purposes to see how students were doing and then maybe respond if there were some challenges. And it then has emerged to, dramatic impact on the pedagogical practices in classrooms because of the need to teach toward the test so that achievement happens, so that funding isn't threatened, so that the school isn't punished for the scores of their students. In 2015, a new version of this act was passed. It's called the Every Student Succeeds Act. It recognized that No Child Left Behind was too prescriptive and revealed a significant equity gap in the achievement of students in poor schools versus students in wealthy schools. This new version of this act does aim to allow states some more latitude in this. A state can omit 1% of student scores from the federal reporting. They can also have some latitude in choosing alternative assessment options. And ESSA, Every Student Succeed Act, also encourages schools to use the minimum amount of test prep time possible. So it has freed schools and districts from some of the more restrictive requirements of No Child Left Behind, but we have yet to really see that sort of emerge in the school culture. And so in public schools where these are required, we still tend to see a lot of the focused on test preparation for their scores. So as we consider testing and standardized testing in our Montessori practice, it's useful to just see how it has emerged in the history of education in the United States as we start to think about how we use it and how we're going to respond to it, especially those of us that have to do standardized testing in a public environment. But a lot of private schools are requiring standardized testing as well. So we're going to talk about research on standardized testing and the implications for us in a Montessori environment, and then how we do consistent assessment in our Montessori environments as well.